George was really good at putting people together in many ways to enable them to work productively. But I tried to think seriously a little bit about why George was so successful. I mean, you've heard a lot about the many different things that were started, or that the ACOA carried on. You know more probably even than that about his American work, which was extraordinary. And it's good to remember that when George retired from the ACOA, he began to take on new campaigns, like he began to work very hard on issues around Cuba. So he was always a campaigner. He didn't much like to still read the book, read the newspaper. But he made a place for me that enabled me to take the work that he had started and grow it as it were. He was quite different from most of the political leftists progressive people that I had known in South Africa. A lot of them were much more doctrinaire, much more left in the classical sense. The trouble about that was that there was always a lot of discussion about who the latest person was to be expelled, because leftists are a bit like Jews, and I'm a Jew so I can say this. They're always disagreeing with each other, and so then, you have to set up another synagogue because you can't go into that synagogue. Although there's actually only one synagogue on the island, and there's only one person on the island, so why did you need another synagogue? I'm not going there. George was not, this caused trouble sometimes for him, because there were times when there were hard decisions that needed to be made, like which group did you give support to? And George tended to talk to everybody, unless they had done really terrible things. And I have different minds about this. Sometimes I think that was being too soft, but sometimes I think that that's what enabled us to build a broader movement. When I asked him once, George, he was a man of great principle, as people have said and stressed, a man of enormous integrity. So I said to him one day, George, but you support the armed struggle, but I thought that you were a pacifist. How did you reconcile those two things? Because we took a lot of flack for the support of the armed struggle. We never raised money for it, but we gave a lot of political support. The financial support went to things like the schools for refugee children. The ANC had a school we supported, Mozambique had a school that we supported. But politically, we supported the armed struggle, and George said, well, I support people's rights. People's rights include the right of self-determination, and if they choose the armed struggle, then who am I to tell them what they should do? So it was interesting for me to hear quite early on in our discussions that he hadn't thought about it a lot. He hadn't just said, yeah, okay, I'll do that here and I'll do that there, and they don't really need to be reconciled. Because for him, they did need to be reconciled, and he did reconcile within the framework of the way he looked at people and at politics. Julius Nyerere once said, and I think he put this in the introduction to the book that George wrote, No One Can Stop the Rain, that one of the things that I think he might have said loved, he certainly loved George, about George was his enormous respect for people, that he treated everybody with respect. And the activists who came from the movements when they were petitioners, when they were not yet famous Nelson Mandelas or Walter Sisulus, but were young petitioners coming from little-known movements, were never treated with respect. They had a terrible time getting into anybody's office, and they were treated shabbily and made to sort of almost beg. And Nyerere said George didn't treat people like that. He talked to them, he listened to them. Anyone who's watched George listen, he really listens. And the amazing thing about him is that he had the most extraordinary memory. I would call up 15 years after we had done something and say, George, do you remember we once met Cousin Guru and oh yes, George. It was at the airport and we were going to, and he was going to, and then we said, I don't know, it could have all been not true, but it sounded familiar. It was wonderful. So his work was enormously built on principles. But it was also sort of practical and activist in its orientation. It's something else that actually we don't talk much about. But I think is intrinsic to what George did was that it required enormous courage. He was doing things that were not popular at all. As Rich Lapchick described, you could suffer physically for doing things that were not popular, as well as being sent off to jail. And George never seemed to be concerned about the amount of courage that these campaigns that he began and worked for took. And the other thing that I think was, and for me of course was the most important about the work that he actually did, was his early recognition of the great importance of focusing on the economic links between, for instance, the US and South Africa, and looking at the economic structures of South Africa and seeing both there and in the United States where one could use levers. In fact, the liberation movements didn't much like these divestment campaigns at that point. They were very eager to have really strong, good political release the political prisoners campaigns. And one could understand that. The prisoners were in jail and having a bad time. And there was a feeling that this kind of campaign, this sort of humanitarian, you might call it almost a noble campaign, would win more friends and more quickly. But George stuck at this recognition that if he could really impact on the flow of wealth, on the investment, on the flow of technology that went, for instance, to South Africa, because that was where the most successful campaign was, one would have a real impact. It's not that this was the sole thing that knocked down the South Africans. It wasn't. There were many, many things that happened. But it was very important. And it was a campaign that enabled lots and lots of people to join together, to bring their organizations to that issue. There were church committees that met to talk about what shall we do with the $300 that we've saved. Shall we buy stock or shall we... There were huge discussions at the level of state. California disinvested in the end. Rich Knight could tell you the exact figures. Millions and millions, and in the end, billions of dollars were pulled out of American corporations by trade unions, by state governments, and it had an impact. It didn't cripple the South African government, but it made corporations begin to think, maybe this isn't such a good idea. Maybe it's not a good idea to invest in South Africa. And for the South African corporations, they began to think, maybe this government is not the best thing that we might have for our future. Because they were all white-owned corporations, and for a long time they had thought this is the way to heaven. But they began to wonder about whether it was indeed the way to heaven. So for all of those reasons, George laid for me a foundation of an organization that you could take and build and grow, and there were very few people on the right side who said, I hate ACOA, or I won't work with ACOA. other side who said that, but we didn't care about those people. But George also has something, and I think Steve said, George had a great sense of fun. So, for instance, we didn't have a lot of money in those days. Not that we ever had a lot of money, but we were a small organisation and we didn't have a lot of money. But we began to go to meetings, to testify, to speak all over the place. And I think it was a Volkswagen that George had. I'm not good at cars. But it was not a very big car, and we used to drive the night before, go to the meeting, and drive and drive and drive. And it was George and I, and a young man called Paul Irish, who Paul mentioned, who Dumasani mentioned, who was a minister's son, and who was basically the administrator for SOA. And the two of them would sing hymns to this Jewish girl. Millions and millions of hymns. They tried to teach them to me, but I said, no, we'll sing the Internationale. And they said, nah, that's too slow. So we sang lots and lots of lively hymns. I thought it was great, actually. I mean, those are the ways in which all sorts of things can be transformed into having fun if you actually are enjoying what you're doing. People have talked about the importance of the strength of the coalitions that George built and that we picked up and kept on building. And so I think I've probably talked, as usual, more than enough, but I want to end. Oh, there's one thing that I also learned from George, actually, which enabled me sometimes to go to work in the morning, even though I knew there was no way we could pay the wages at the end of the day. George used to say when we wanted to start something new, and I'd say, or the bookkeeper would say, or somebody would say, but George, how are we going to pay for this? Oh, said George, we'll fly by the seat of our pants. He loved that saying. I'd never heard that before. I had to ask him for this. But we did actually fly by the seat of our pants. It was quite amazing. And I think about that often now because I find often in non-profit organising now, in progressive non-profit organising, that people aren't prepared to jump in and fly by. They're worrying about the budget and how they're going to, and we need to have a business plan in place, and we would never have done half the things we've done if we first had to have, I'm not sure, we probably had somebody who knew how to do a business plan. I think Paul did. But we certainly didn't think that way, and we learned the way to think about those things from George. We had some good friends who sometimes would come to the rescue. Some of them are even sitting in this audience. But basically, if it was the right thing to do, and if it was strategic at that moment to do it, George would tend to jump in and do it. And I think that's an important lesson. I get upset when I hear people thinking too much about the business practicalities. But I think maybe I would end with something that I read when I was recently in George's book, when I was reading it actually just after he died. He quotes towards right at the end, as he's finishing off, having thought about the good things and the bad things. And it's true, George was not cynical, but he had to face the fact that after liberation, in many countries, things did not get wonderfully better or immensely transformed. In most places, there was progress. But, and in places like South Africa, we see that now today. But there's a lot still to be done. And thinking about that and writing about that, he says, and I will read it to you, a phrase that was popular during the liberation struggle in Mozambique, a luta continua, the struggle continues, is both good politics and good theology. I find that interesting. The struggle for a better person, a better life, a better country, and a better world never ends. Perhaps the moment of greatest freedom is found as we engage in the struggle to achieve it. And that moment is always with us. So, George had his moment always.
Thank you, Jerry. I just want to note Stephen Hauser, who started our remembrances, noted wonderful obituaries that were in both the New York Times and the Washington Post for George. And it was significant that how little about Africa and this work that comprised the majority of his life and ministry was referenced in those two just fabulous obituaries. So we're really blessed to have all these voices that have been shared this morning about this centerpiece of George's work through the years. We will finish our formal remembrances with Marty Lays, George's daughter.
So I'm bookending this amazing collection of remembrances of my dad. And mine is going to be a little bit more like Steve's, who started out. Because to me, George Hauser was my daddy. I had the last 6 years to be close to both my parents. And it was an opportunity for me to bring our relationship full circle, an opportunity for me to give back so much of what I had received. And it actually has been my lifetime of registering what all of those gifts have been. My dad died at 3:45 p.m. on Wednesday, August 19th, 2015. He was 99 years old. A long journey and a long trajectory in our relationship of 71 years. I was with him when he took his last breath, singing one of his very favorite songs, which, by the way, you are going to have an opportunity to sing with me, Dona Nobis. I am grateful that he lived for 99 years, and I'm grateful that he and my mom chose to move to California within 20 minutes of where I lived, joining a wonderful Quaker-inspired community called Friends House. I know my dad adored me, and I adored him. He would often say to me, "You are my favorite daughter," which was a safe statement because I am his only daughter. I revered my dad. I emulated him. I wanted to be like him. I embraced his values wholeheartedly. I loved it that my parents moved to a cooperative community, Skyview Acres, represented here in part by wonderful Ed Simons, who at 98 played Air on a G-string, which I remember dancing to when I was a little girl, around the edge of our oriental Chinese carpet. Thank you for playing that. And it was wonderful that Jan played Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, which was played at my parents' wedding. And so that is all very, very moving. So back to the values that I embraced. I remember as an elementary school student rather proudly marching off to the principal's office when there were air raid drills. I was one of a small group of students who would go sit in the principal's office rather than participating in the air raid drills. I remember being devastated by a film that the FOR showed on Hiroshima. I was just crying uncontrollably. I remember working with a mentor and a few other young people to start a peace group called Rockland County Youth for Peace. And I remember participating in a Washington Peace March. I loved the feeling of being part of a community which espoused peace and brotherhood and sisterhood of all of the world's peoples. And I thought that the world's peoples were like a grand design. All colors, all religions, all races. It was just such a beautiful dream and an image. Anyway, being part of this community of like-minded people made me feel safe as a young girl. I was inspired by my dad to spend a year in Africa, and it was wonderful to be there on the continent where everywhere I went, I was embraced by people who knew and admired my dad. One of my fellow Operation Crossroads members of the group that I originally went over to Africa with in 1964 is here today, and I'm very happy for that. So, a few other things about my dad. He was a teacher. He taught me some of those little things that Steve talked about. I learned to swim from my dad, to play ping pong, to canoe, to drive a car, and to skip stones, among other things. My dad loved peanut butter, and this is a legacy that has been passed down through the family. He would say if anybody would make him a peanut butter sandwich after a Thanksgiving dinner, he would eat it. So, one Thanksgiving I did. And yes, after dessert and all, he ate the whole thing. Dad and I had a tradition concerning our birthdays. I was born on June 3rd, and he was born on June 2nd. So when I moved to California, we had an agreement that one of us would call the other at 9 o'clock California time, which would be 12 a.m. New York time, and that way we could each wish each other happy birthday on our actual birthdays. In certain ways, it was not easy growing up the daughter of George Hauser. It took me many years to learn that I did not have to be my dad, I did not even have to be like my dad to embody his values. Now I realize that that integration of becoming the persons we are is a challenge that's faced by every person, no matter who her or his parents are. So music was a very important part of our family life. Every Saturday morning my mom would make waffles and we would dance in the kitchen, my dad and I, to folk songs, to the Weavers, the Kingston Trio, the Limelighters, and others. As a family we listened to Harry Belafonte, Miriam Makeba, Pete Seeger. We would sing Christmas carols at Christmas. My mother would play the piano. And all kinds of camp songs and rounds. We traveled across the country singing all the way. My dad and I had a favorite song called, I call it the Old Apple Tree Song. And I loved it so much I made him teach it to me. And ever since that, we've sung it together. There's no time now, but I'll be glad to sing it. later. During the last year of my dad's life, I sang to him a lot. I took the Friend's House hymn sing. Well, I took him to the Friend's House hymn sing every Sunday morning. And I sang hymns to him and all the folk songs and the campfire songs that we sang during my childhood. And it was a real bonding experience that last year of his life. In closing, I would like to read a stanza from a poem I wrote the day after Dad died. The title of the poem is We Go Out Singing, and that must have come to me from the title of the book that he and Herb Shore wrote about Walter Sisulu. It just came to me. I didn't realize at the time that it must have come so much from that book about Walter Sisulu. But here it is. My dad's song continues. He added much to the conversations of this world, rich harmonies and discords that so many will use, work with, play with, and continue the unending creative process that is life. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. We will have a few brief minutes for additional reflections. We want to invite the Consul General, Matula Nkosi, if she would like to share some words to start, and we'll offer about 10 minutes in total. So if anyone wishes to speak, please come over to the side here and talk to me. I'll be over here. We'll start with you. We can use this mic, or if you would like a hand.
I greet you all and I thank you very much for having come out to honor this great man, one of many who have brought us to where we are now as South Africans. I'll try to be as brief as I can, but as all the speakers were talking, I just had so many thoughts that went through my mind, and I'm glad that I will be able to share just some of them. I was not born during much of the time that has been spoken about in the 60s. I was only born around after the middle of the 60s. However, I stand here as a beneficiary of the fruits of your labor. I am one of those South Africans who have benefited from all the positives that have come out of the apartheid struggle. I've lived through much of what has been spoken about, all the bad times that have been recounted. I have read about much of it. I learned about the struggle at university. So a lot of what was said today rings a lot of bells in my head. The history is very rich. One realizes in times like these that a person like me will never know the full depth of what went on during the time, will never know all of the struggles that were waged by different people in different parts of the world. However, I am amazed by the dedication of people who lived thousands of miles away, who were not directly affected by what my parents and the generations before them had endured, but shared our pain. And so in thanking you all, let me say, the work is not done. The rubber has met the tar all across the continent, but rebuilding is proving to be as difficult, as complex, but as rewarding as I'm sure was the struggle for freedom for you all. In paying tribute to George and many like him, allow me to say, the struggle continues, Alita continue. Africa will rise. Africa is rising. In my country in particular, and I dare say across the rest of the continent, the young of Africa are once again standing up. You will have seen images that many said were reminiscent of the 1976 student uprising. We will not go there. All I'm saying is that the young of Africa are once again standing up,